So this is COVID-19 and new models of data stewardship. I put COVID-19 in the title because everyone else had COVID-19 in the title. But this project was actually scoped and started up before we went into lockdown. So a kind of balance we tried to strike with this research was make it useful for the current pandemic context, but also continue to have that kind of longer vision and make it relevant for a post-COVID-19 context as well. So you'll see that coming through in the research. It's trying to meet, satisfy those two masters. So I'll just talk about a bit of background to the project and the report that we just published. I'll mention the 3 use cases and their relevance to COVID-19. I'll talk about our general recommendations and then some key specific COVID-19 takeaways. If you don't know us, I come from the Open Data Institute. We work with companies and governments to build an open, trustworthy data ecosystem where people can make better decisions using data and manage any harmful impacts. ODI HQ, ODI leads, very connected, so you're probably very familiar with us. But the Health Foundation are an independent charity committed to bringing about better health and healthcare for the UK. The context for this bit of research, like I said, it started off before coronavirus and COVID-19. And the real challenge that which Adam Steventon, Director of Data Analytics at the Health Foundation, put really succinctly is healthcare systems are seeking to accelerate the adoption of digital and data-driven technologies. While medicines and drugs are tested within randomized controlled trials, the approach for digital technologies is that they are tested in the wild and adapted over time in response to learning. And what he goes on to say in his foreword for the report is that often these new data-driven technologies are developed by private sector innovators, and so you need to, in order to perform an appropriate evaluation of that technology, you need access to data from that private sector organization and public sector organizations, and as we found in all the workshops we ran, contextual data from other aspects of society, and you need to be able to bring that all together in some meaningful way. So the goal of the project was to explore how new models of data stewardship can support the sharing of health data between the public and private sector to support the evaluation of new digital or data-driven health technologies. I think a really useful comparison for evaluations is in terms of pharmaceutical drug trials, which Adam mentioned in his foreword, where those will go through 4 stages of assessment and evaluation. Speaking kind of broadly, digital technologies will go through 2, kind of behind the scenes, and then the 3rd and 4th are conducted in the wild, live. And so that makes it really difficult to kind of continue to assess the impact of those technologies, because it's much harder to control or identify and isolate your variables, and the impact of that technology is live. It's much more widespread. One thing to be aware of from the title of this project, so applying new models of data stewardship, what do we mean by data stewardship? Stewarding, the way that we talk about it at the ODI, is stewarding data involves collecting, maintaining, and sharing data. And this includes making decisions about who has access to it, for what purpose, and to whose benefit. So what we were asked to do was to identify ecosystems where data wasn't being shared, wasn't flowing, and try to identify how to get data flowing in the right way. And part of that might be what we're calling data institutions. The term is still being defined, but essentially, could you create or install an institution within an ecosystem that would help to kind of balance competing interests, or give you independent third-party stewardship so that data can flow, so that organizations, sources, and users can feel comfortable sharing that data. So we did 3 use cases. We thought use cases would enable us to go really concrete and look at concrete challenges, and then zoom back out from that and give kind of overarching lessons and takeaways. The first one was digital first primary care services, so things like Babylon, GP at hand, and your first interaction with the health and care system is digital, and then through that service you are then directed to other digital services or other non-digital services. We thought this one would be worth exploring because of the power dynamics between private sector innovators and evaluators. As I said, most of these use cases, kind of almost just through serendipity, ended up being particularly useful in a COVID-19 context. So in a pandemic, in a lockdown, when people still have continuing health needs that they need from the NHS, how do you ensure that you are directing people through the health system in the most efficient, effective, but also safe way? And part of that is through scaling up a lot of digital-first primary care services. The second one we looked at was online information and misinformation and its impact on vaccine hesitancy. So how might evaluators assess the impact of online misinformation on not only vaccine hesitancy, but ultimately the health of individuals and the population as a whole? We thought this was worth investigating because online platforms, while they sit outside the health sector, they nonetheless impact on public health. And so therefore might want to be evaluated from someone like the Health Foundation. Obviously, this also has a real pertinence to COVID-19. I think we can already see a lot of misinformation being spread online, not only about coronavirus, 5G, but also potentially looking forward to, if there is a vaccine developed, already a lot of information and misinformation swirling around that vaccine. The third one we looked at was patient flow automation tools. These are tools designed to really just nail your real-time data flows within a hospital or a health sector. And then not only that, but be able to start modeling the flows of patients through your hospital or resources, and then be able to take actions based on those predictions. So maybe the model shows that there's generally an uptick in the need for beds in a particular ward in this month. Therefore, you need to start creating space by taking patients and moving them to different wards or out of the hospital. It's about identifying those peaks and bottlenecks and taking steps to alleviate them. We thought this would be interesting because it doesn't directly interact with patients. So as far as the main recommendations, this one, which I've worded as, I guess, kind of tongue-in-cheek, be more empirical, AKA do science. And what we realized when we started having our workshops was that there was an expectation that, particularly within the Babylon use case, that a data institution could come in and it could balance those competing interests and could leverage private sector organizations into providing access to data, or maybe the models that sit behind their services. But what we found was actually data institutions are less useful. Well, it's more useful to have a data institution when you don't already have a lot of leverage, when you're trying to balance competing interests or provide some sort of independent kind of arm's length stewardship. But in this case, we found that the NHS has a lot of leverage here to dictate the type of data that they need in order to perform an appropriate evaluation. And that's because private sector organizations, companies want access to the NHS market. Therefore, we recommended putting specific recommendations, well, not even recommendations, requirements and clauses within contracts at the procurement stage to say, yes, we're going to need access to this type of data for this purpose, for this evaluator. And linked into that, we also recommended that innovators should get evaluators in the room early on to start arranging that data collection, because what the evaluators told us in our workshops was that often a company and an NHS trust would say, we want you to evaluate the impact of this technology, and a year after it had been implemented, and the type of data you need. And I think what's been coming out in this session is that you don't just need health data and data from a commercial organization. You need contextual data. You need data from local authorities. You need data from geography in order to help you identify and isolate your variables. And that needs to be collected from the beginning. So that's why we boiled it all down to be more empirical, aka do science. And the next step for this is to get evaluators connected with the NHS to actually start putting that into contracts. The second big recommendation was evaluators, and actually just a lot of organizations in the health sector who regularly collect, store, use, and share data should start thinking of themselves as data institutions. And this gets to a point that we try to make, that data institutions, the way we talk about them, don't necessarily need to be, you are creating out of thin air a new institution to sit within an ecosystem. It can also be about existing organizations taking on new roles and looking to take the data that they have, that they've acquired, and with appropriate permissions, then make that data available, findable, accessible for other organizations for other purposes. So we recommended that they look to repurpose the data that they collect through just naturally going through the process of an evaluation, and look to repurpose it for another evaluation that they might themselves do, or to share it more widely with academic researchers, other evaluators. And so a next step here is to work with organizations like the Health Foundation to explore what would that mean, what types of things would you need to do, how would you need to change permissions in how you collect data in the first place, so that the subjects of that data know that you are then going to use it in a potentially different context. What does the IG look like for that sort of arrangement? And then finally, lessons for a post-COVID world. And this is all in the report if this whistle-stop tour, loosely speaking, is too quick. But essentially, we thought that in a post-COVID world, a rush to adopt digital technologies runs the risk of creating a digital divide. There's been huge promise shown by digital first primary technologies, but we shouldn't just then say, okay, let's rush ahead with installing these everywhere, because we need to know where people are cut out of the system by these types of technologies. Second, we shouldn't expect the same willingness to collaborate or share data going forward. And this is something that came out in all the workshops we ran, regardless of who was talking to us. So it might apply to patients. Patients might not be as willing to commit to data altruism for a different topic. I think the point is that COVID-19 and this pandemic is such a particular point in time that we can't expect it to continue. And it was particularly interesting, I think, for even health and care staff. A lot of health and care staff spoke to us about, we're happy to share data in this context, but we also really do worry about sharing data even within the health sector, because we don't know, we know how it's been collected, what some of the limitations of it are, but we don't know that once it's shared, whether that organization will understand, and it might reflect poorly on us, it might even affect our funding. So those types of questions are important for even health and care staff. And then also we spoke to a particularly large social media platform that began at Harvard. And one of the people that, that worked for them said, you shouldn't expect social media platforms and online companies in general to have such an amount of agreement going forward. COVID-19 is a particular point in time where, yes, pretty much everyone in the world is agreed that this is a challenge and we're willing to do things based on that. But we can't expect the same sort of agreement for things beyond that, even potentially for vaccines, anti-vaccination, MMR, those types of challenges. Last one, top-down approaches should not become the default. We spoke to a lot of organizations who had developed small implementations of a new technology in their NHS trust, and then that had scaled regionally and then nationally, and they were advocating for continued effort and commitment to that type of innovation, rather than what has shown to be useful and also somewhat limited. I'll just stop there, of more top-down driven kind of government-led innovation. So those were our 3 lessons for a post-COVID world. Like I said, all of this is in the report, and it's linked within this slide deck, which will be posted on the website, I believe, at the end of this talk.